Looking back on it now, I really wish I would have invested my money into something. I really wish I would have recognized the online poker, maybe got into some sort of ownership into online. Maybe not, because it was sort of illegal at that time, so that probably wouldn't have been a good idea. But just who knows what it could have been into. Maybe I should have invested into poker listings or something.
Brad Booth was a name whispered in the hallways of the Bellagio, a fearless high-stakes warrior who once lived inside poker's most legendary battlegrounds. He didn't just play poker, he breathed it, bled it, and at his peak dictated the pace of the biggest games in the world. Then, just as suddenly as he arrived, he vanished, not once, but twice. At the height of his career, Booth bluffed Phil Ivey out of a six-figure pot on national television, sending the poker world into a frenzy. He moved millions across the felt, swung up and down the price of a Ferrari on a given night, and for a while, it looked like he was untouchable. But poker has a way of humbling even the most fearless, and Booth was no exception. He went from crushing Bobby's Room to grinding 1-3 cash games in the Pacific Northwest, from playing against legends to running from his own debts, and the worst part, it wasn't just bad luck or reckless bankroll management that brought him down. He was cheated, and not in the way most poker players claim to be after a bad beat. No, Booth was one of the biggest victims of the ultimate bet scandal, a scandal that saw millions siphoned from players who never even had a chance to win. Booth's journey isn't just about poker, it's about what happens when the game you love turns against you, when the swings aren't just about money, but trust, identity, and survival. Because if there's one thing Brad Booth's story proves, it's that poker doesn't just take your chips, it takes everything. Brad Booth didn't stumble into poker, he was consumed by it. From the moment he first shuffled the deck, the game had him, and it never let go. As a teenager, he would hitchhike for hours just to sit in the closest card rooms, playing against older, tougher opponents, learning the hard way that poker doesn't care about your excuses, it only cares about the truth. And the truth was, Booth could play. By his 20s, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. He climbed through the stakes with a relentless determination, moving from underground Canadian games to the neon-lit jungle of Las Vegas. If poker was a war, Booth was a frontline soldier, fearless, aggressive, and utterly indifferent to conventional wisdom. He wasn't interested in grinding out small edges, he wanted to break his opponents. He wanted them questioning everything they thought they knew about the game, and for a while, it worked. Then came high-stakes poker. Television changed everything. Booth went from being a feared name in the back rooms of Vegas to a player everyone recognized. And in one defining moment, he became a legend. The hand was against Phil Ivey. Booth, holding 4 deuce suited, was out of position against the most dangerous player in the world. On the surface, it was a mismatch. But Booth wasn't playing the cards. He was playing the man. The flop came 6-7-3. Ivey, sitting on pocket kings, had every reason to believe he was ahead. But Booth had other ideas. A bet, then a raise. Ivey tanked, the cameras rolled, the poker world held its breath, and then, after what felt like an eternity, Ivey folded. He had been beaten, not by the cards, but by Booth's sheer audacity. It was the kind of moment that made careers, the kind that players dream about, that fans replay over and over. But in Booth's case, it wasn't the start of a dynasty, it was the peak before the fall. Because while that bluff against Ivey cemented his reputation, it also revealed something deeper about Booth's approach to the game. He wasn't just a fearless player, he was addicted to the rush. And in poker, that addiction is dangerous. Booth was the kind of guy who didn't just make high-variance plays, he lived them. He moved into the Bellagio for 18 months, spending $25,000 a month just to be closer to the action. He played swings that would break most players, dropping hundreds of thousands one night and winning it all back the next. He wasn't worried about losing, because in his mind, there was always another game, always another hand. But poker doesn't care about confidence. It doesn't care how many hours you've put in, or how much heart you have. Eventually, the deck turns cold. The opponents get sharper, and sometimes the game itself is rigged against you. Booth was about to learn that the hard way, and when he did, it wouldn't just cost him money, it would cost him everything. Booth's problem wasn't that he lost. Every poker player loses. The problem was how he lost, and who he lost to. It started subtly, a few bad sessions, a bankroll that wasn't moving in the right direction. But Booth had been through downswings before, and he wasn't the type to panic. He just needed to keep playing. The variance would correct itself, the wins would come, except this time they didn't, because this time the game was rigged. The ultimate bet scandal is one of the darkest chapters in poker history, a multi-million-dollar scheme that made sure certain players could see their opponent's hole cards in real time. A god mode cheat designed not just to beat the best players in the world, but to rob them. And Booth, he was one of its biggest victims. Imagine sitting down at a poker table where the guy across from you knows exactly what you have. Every bluff, every thin value bet, every discipline fold, it doesn't matter. You can't win. You never had a chance. But the brilliance of the scam was that it didn't feel like cheating. The losses weren't obvious. The cheaters didn't win every hand. They just won enough. Enough to drain the bankrolls of some of the best poker players in the world without raising suspicion. Booth was losing millions, but to him, it just looked like a brutal downswing. His signature aggression, the very thing that had built his career, was suddenly working against him. His bluffs were getting snapped off. His value bets were running into monsters. And when he finally got it all in, they always had it. He wasn't alone. Dozens of players were being cheated, but they didn't know it. And even if they suspected something was off, what were they supposed to do? Complain that the game felt unfair? That's poker. Sometimes you just lose. For Booth, it was catastrophic. He estimated that at least $2.5 million of his losses were due to ultimate bet. But the damage wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Poker is a game of confidence. You have to trust your reads, believe in your instincts. But what happens when every read is wrong? When the instincts that once made you great now feel like a cruel joke? Booth wasn't just losing money, he was losing himself. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, Black Friday happened.
Multi-billion-dollar industry with millions of participants, and on Friday, it was shut down by federal agents.
The US government shut down online poker, freezing millions of dollars in player funds overnight. Booth was supposed to get money back from Ultimate Bet. He never saw a cent. At that moment, he was done. No bankroll, no confidence, no way to recover. He had spent his career walking a tightrope between brilliance and disaster, and now he had fallen. But Booth wasn't the type to admit defeat. He had one last option, one last way to keep playing. He just needed a loan. The problem was, the doors that had once swung open for him were now bolted shut. The high-stakes community is small, and reputation spread fast. A player who runs bad can always find backing, so long as they still inspire confidence. But a player who is broken, that's a different story. Booth wasn't just losing, he was unraveling. So he turned to what many poker players do in desperate times. He borrowed. Doug Polk's story is the most famous, but it's far from the only one. The post on 2+2 spelled it out. Booth had asked for $13,000 from Polk, promising a 1-for-1 cash swap. The transaction went through smoothly. Then, a second request. $30,000 this time. Polk, still believing in the Booth he had watched on high-stakes poker, sent the money. And then came the meeting. Polk was expecting a simple handoff. Instead, Booth showed up and dropped the truth. He was broke. He had debts everywhere, no real plan to pay them back. And then, just like that, he disappeared. Changed his number, moved out of the country. 1 minute, he was a respected pro. The next, a ghost. It wasn't just Polk. Booth had borrowed from others. The numbers weren't small. In an era where staking deals were common and poker debts often handled on trust, Booth's situation was different. He wasn't chasing variance, he was chasing survival. And everyone in the high-stakes world knew that once a player starts borrowing just to stay in the game, they're already past the point of no return. For most, this would have been the end. A slow fade into obscurity, maybe a low-stakes grind somewhere in the Midwest, a name that old-school pros mentioned in passing. Remember Yukon Brad? But Booth wasn't done making headlines, because in 2020, he disappeared again. And this time, it wasn't just from poker, it was from everything. It started like a regular day. He told his roommate he was going camping, took a truck, packed light, and then nothing. No messages, no sightings, no Booth. Days passed, then weeks. The poker world took notice. A missing person report was filed. Friends, family, and poker players alike started to worry. Was this just another escape from his debts? A desperate attempt to disappear from the poker world that had left him behind? Or was it something darker? Because Booth wasn't just broke, he was broken. Years of mental exhaustion, financial pressure, and personal demons had been piling up. The swings in poker are brutal, but the swings in life can be even worse. And after everything, the losses, the debts, the ultimate bet scandal, he had every reason to step away. Theories started swirling. Some believed he had fled, trying to outrun the weight of everything he owed. Others feared the worst. High-stakes poker has no shortage of stories that end in tragedy. When a player disappears, it doesn't take long before whispers of the real reason start to spread. 2 months later, the mystery ended, but without answers. Booth was found, alive, safe. No details, no explanations, just a quiet reassurance from his family. But the questions didn't stop. What had happened during those months? What pushed him to leave, and what brought him back? Booth never really explained, and maybe he never will. But when he did return, one thing was certain. He was no longer the player he once was, and the poker world had already moved on. High-stakes poker had evolved. The names that once filled the biggest games, Booth, Gus Hansen, Sammy Farha, were relics of another era, replaced by a new breed of player. GTO solvers, database analysis, precision bankroll management. The game was no longer built for gamblers, it was built for scientists. And Booth, he had spent his career ignoring the math, trusting his instincts, riding the wave of variance like it was a personal roller coaster. But poker doesn't reward nostalgia. It doesn't care how famous you used to be. When Booth returned, there was no comeback tour, no triumphant resurgence. Instead, he found himself grinding low-stakes cash games in Oregon, playing for pots that barely matched the antes of the games he once dominated. And for the first time in his career, he had to face a truth far more brutal than any bad beat. The game wasn't going to save him. Booth had always believed that if you played long enough, if you sat at the table and just kept playing, things would even out. The cards would come back around, the bankroll would rebuild, but that only works when you have the capital to stay in the game. Booth had burned through every lifeline. So now, for the first time, he had to do something even tougher than playing high stakes. He had to pay back what he owed, which given the state of his bankroll wasn't going to be easy. Booth wasn't just in debt, he was buried in it. For years, his name had been attached to stories of unpaid loans, of money borrowed with vague promises of repayment, of friendships that had quietly dissolved the moment the stakes got too high. Doug Polk's loan was just the most publicized case, but it was far from the only one. There were whispers, other poker pros, other debts, all lingering in the background, waiting for a resolution that never came. And for nearly a decade, there was no resolution. Booth disappeared, the money was gone, the debts, in the eyes of most, were uncollectible. Until now. Booth recently resurfaced, not with a staking deal or a bankroll replenishing score, but with something far more unexpected, an attempt to make things right. He appeared on a podcast, openly admitting to his financial failures, acknowledging his debts and, most shocking of all, starting to pay them back. Not in lump sums, not in six-figure wire transfers, but in small incremental payments. Doug Polk confirmed it. After nearly a decade of silence, Booth had begun sending payments toward the $21,000 he still owed. They weren't large, sometimes just a few $100s at a time, but they were steady. More importantly, they were voluntary. No lawsuits, no public pressure, just a quiet, deliberate attempt to settle old debts. The move raised questions. Was this a genuine act of redemption, or was it just another attempt to salvage what little remained of his reputation? Because while Booth may have been paying Polk back, there were still other debts. Other names, other figures still waiting for their cut. And then, Booth did something no one expected. He put out his personal email, an open invitation to anyone he still owed, telling them to reach out. For a man who had spent years avoiding uncomfortable conversations, it was a surprising turn. And for the poker world, it was a rare thing, a player from the old guard, openly confronting their mistakes. But here's the real question. Is Booth truly on the road to redemption? Or is this just another chapter in a story that never seems to end? Brad Booth's story isn't just about poker. It's about what happens when the game takes more than it gives back. When the swings aren't just about money, but about trust, reputation, and survival. He was cheated, buried in debt, and left behind by a game that never stops moving. Now, he's grinding low stakes, trying to make things right. But in poker, once you fall, you rarely get a second shot. Speaking of poker legends who lost it all, Jamie Gold had one of the most satisfying downfalls the game has ever seen. Click here to find out how the biggest loudmouth in WSOP history crashed harder than anyone thought possible.